This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Orbis.
The terrorism warning lights are blinking red again. That's the title of a recent Foreign Affairs article by Graham Allison of Harvard and Michael Morell. We'll be right back to talk with Michael Morell about the terrorism landscape today after a quick break. I'm Andy McCreadis, and this is Intelligence Matters.
Rooted in the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities, Orbis is investing today in the people and capabilities needed to deliver national security tomorrow. Data is everywhere and easy to acquire. The intelligence mission requires new thinking and new approaches to make the most of that data. That's where Orbis is making a difference. Unburdened by legacy business models, we're building the intelligence business of the future. We provide highly empowered, creative teams that deliver impactful outcomes and asymmetric capabilities for our clients worldwide. If you're looking for a strategic ally with experience navigating the complexities of the modern information environment, or if you envision contributing your unique experiences to elevate global security, then we're ready for you. Connect with us at intelligencematters@orbis.com. That's intelligencematters@orbis.com. Uncover the extraordinary with Orbis.
Good morning, Michael. It feels weird to welcome you to the podcast.
I feel welcomed, Andy.
Okay, good. So today we're going to talk about an article that you and Graham Allison wrote for Foreign Affairs called "The Terrorism Warning Lights Are Blinking Red Again." But before we get to that, Michael, last week the Southern District of New York unsealed a video, pre-911 video, of a guy named Bayoumi. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because it's going to be relevant, I think, to today's discussion.
Sure, absolutely. I actually think this is a very important issue.
Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I watched the video. Tell us a little bit about, what it was and what are the downstream implications for that.
Yeah. Maybe we should start with, who is Bayoumi, right? So his full name is Omar al-Bayoumi. He's a Saudi national. He's currently living in Saudi Arabia. In the pre-911 period, he resided in San Diego, where he lived under a loose cover, and where he provided some support to both Saudi intelligence, which I don't know what that was, and to the Saudi Ministry of Religious Affairs in support of the work they do in the local mosques there. He also had contact with multiple Saudi diplomatic personnel in Los Angeles and in Washington. He also had contact with and provided some limited support, such as co-signing the lease on their apartment of two of the 9/11 hijackers who were first in Los Angeles and then in San Diego. In its final report, the 9/11 Commission said most, but not all, of what I just outlined. And the 9/11 Commission said that both they and the FBI had interviewed Bayoumi post 9/11, of course. So the video, Andy, is that in 1999, Bayoumi comes to Washington, D.C., and he tapes over what appears to be the course of a day a video of the Capitol, the mall, and areas around the mall. I watched not only the portion of the video that 60 Minutes produced and was on the CBS Evening News on Friday, but I watched the entirety of the video. In my sense, strong sense, I should say, is that it was a casing video of the Capitol. Bayoumi is clearly focused on security in the area. He is talking to someone not there. He is, narrating the video to somebody who's not there. It seems from what he says that he has been tasked to make this video. He also says some things that can be interpreted as extremist views. Andy, my gut reaction is that this was a casing video, and that it was a casing video for al-Qaeda. My gut reaction is that Bayoumi was al-Qaeda. I think I would need more than just watching the video to come to that conclusion as an analyst, but that was my first thought and my gut reaction. I should also say, Andy, that I found watching the video chilling. I mean, it literally sent chills down my spine. Watching what I thought was a casing, knowing what happened on 9/11, knowing that the Capitol was the fourth target, right? The target of United Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So that's Bayoumi, and that's the video.
So that was 23 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot's changed.
Yeah, for sure.
Since then. So let's maybe have this discussion about the article that you and Graham wrote. The title being Terrorism.
Hey, can I just?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Andy, can I just say one more thing, which I think is important about the video? It raises serious questions about who Bayoumi was. Right? Was he al-Qaeda? Was there an al-Qaeda support network in the U.S. that we didn't know before? But based on the evidence I have seen, this does not take me to Saudi government complicity in 9/11 or foreknowledge of 9/11, right? Just doesn't even come close to that. So I think that's important to say.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So the article is Terrorism Warning Lights Are Blinking Red Again, and I thought that was a great title. I know that's a phrase that George Tenet used and certainly was mentioned in the 9/11 report. I think he said that the system was blinking red in the summer of 2001.
Yeah. And it was the title of a book that Michael Allen, our colleague at Beacon, wrote about 9/11 and what we needed to do as a government to make sure it never happened again.
Never happens again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also know that George Tenet spoke numerous times with policymakers in the White House about his concerns. And as it says in the 9/11 report, there were over 40 intelligence articles in the PDB talking about the terrorism threat. So that was then.
Yeah.
Today we're hearing from people like Christopher Wray, who has come out pretty strongly about his concerns. So why don't we talk about that? And for our audience, Graham wasn't able to join us today, so maybe Michael, you want to say a few words about Graham, and then we can get into the article.
Yeah. Most importantly, Graham is a great guy. I love Graham. I love talking to Graham. I love bouncing ideas off Graham. I love when he bounces his ideas off me. But just so people know who Graham is, Graham was the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. He was the longtime director of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, leading expert on the Cuban Missile Crisis, author of the book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now among the really leading thinkers on where our relationship with China is growing. So fantastic guy, and super smart and connected, and and I should say, based on what you said, Andy, that the origins of this article were former senior CIA officials calling me over the past 3-4 months saying, have you seen what Christopher Wray is saying to Congress, and does it bring back memories? And I would say, yes, I've been following it, and absolutely it brings back memories of the pre-9/11 period. And then Graham called me, and he said, Michael, have you been following Christopher Wray's testimonies, and do you see parallels? And as soon as he said that, I said, yes, absolutely, because I knew what he was going to say, right? Parallels with the pre-9/11 period. So that's the origins of the article.
So as we said a few moments ago, a lot's changed in 20 plus years, especially our ability and preparedness for terrorist attacks or terrorism. So there's just a lot of people now saying that they're concerned. It's not only Christopher Wray, it's a commander of CENTCOM. The DNI recently said that the October 7th attack and then the response to it could be a generational change in terrorism. So how is this landscape evolving today?
Yeah, and to be clear, we're talking about threats to the homeland here, right? So I think there's a whole set of things. So one is the post October 7th period, right? And people, unhappy with Muslims because of what Hamas did, or people who are unhappy with Israel for how Israel has responded and the risk of really lone wolf attacks, as a result of that. And also, the response to the Hamas invasion of Israel has led a large number of international terrorist groups to put out statements, encouraging attacks. So that's one, right? That's one. Two is the significant growth in capability of ISIS-K. ISIS-K is the terrorist group in Afghanistan. And, quite frankly, it gained significant strength after we left. Some of us were warning about the consequences of both al-Qaeda and ISIS gaining strength. Al-Qaeda really didn't. ISIS did. And how do you see that, right? You see that in terms of successful attacks. One in Iran earlier this year killed the most Iranians in a terrorist attack since the Iranian Revolution. And more recently, the attack on the Moscow concert hall that killed, I think, 140 or so. Really brutal attack and how it was carried out. And then at least two failed attacks in Western Europe, one against the cathedral in Cologne and one against the parliament in Sweden, both of those foiled by German intelligence and German police. And then what appears to be, Andy, at least a handful of foiled attacks in the United States, including one that we just heard about, right, with the arrest of 8 Tajiks, who had ties to ISIS. Right? They weren't arrested on terrorism charges, but I think they wanted to sweep them up, and really make sure. But there are real concerns about whether they were operating on behalf of ISIS-K. So that's another issue, right? A third, another issue is Iran's continuing desire to get revenge for the U.S. targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, very senior Iranian official. They've tried before. An individual in the United States was arrested, and we know that he was being directed by an official from Iran to conduct an attack against the former National Security Advisor John Bolton. That was foiled. So that's another set, right? And then you have one of the most worrisome things, right? Which is it's difficult to come into the United States with terrorist intentions or terrorist ties, in a airport or that sort of thing. It's a lot easier to come across the southern border. And there's been a number of folks who's come across the southern border in the last year who have had terrorist leanings, at least. And so that's another, right? That's a vulnerability that I think that terrorists now see that they might not have seen, 10 years ago. That's another issue. And then the last issue I would point out is is the watch listing system is not what it should be. Maybe this is not the second to last. The watch listing system is not what it should be. The Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security just put out a report earlier this month that was really critical of where the watch listing system was, whether it really brought together all the information, whether the technology was what it needed to be, did CBP really have the access to it that they needed to, right, on a as needed mission-based, system. So that's another. And then the last one I'll say, and Sam Vinograd, who I worked with in the Obama administration, she was the assistant secretary at Homeland Security for vetting. She covered that, was in her portfolio, and she just last week was on Face the Nation, and she talked about how the shifting focus from counterterrorism to other issues in the intelligence community, national security community has reduced the amount of information that's in the vetting system. So you kind of put all those together, right? And you put those together with what are pretty stark warnings from the FBI director over and over and over again the last 10 months or so, and you get to our blinking red.
So there's a lot here to talk about. Maybe we can start with ISIS-K, which is probably not super familiar to a lot of people. And also the point that you made, they're not friends with Iran or Pakistan. They don't have a sponsor per se, right? They've attacked inside various other countries.
And they're at war with the Taliban, right?
And they're at war with the Taliban.
Because they want to take over Afghanistan.
Right. So can you say a little bit about ISIS-K and how it differs from ISIS that everyone remembers hearing about?
So ISIS-K starts in Iraq and Syria. It was at one point al-Qaeda in Iraq, but when they crossed the border into Syria, they figured they needed to change their name, and they didn't want to be part of al-Qaeda. So that was formed first, and then it inspired other groups around the world to take on the ISIS name and the ISIS mantle. And that's how ISIS-K started. And it brought together the most extreme elements of the Taliban, who, people who were in the Taliban and didn't think it was extremist enough, and same with al-Qaeda, right? So it brought together the most extremist elements of those two groups. That's ISIS-K. Large number of attacks over the years against first the Afghan government and now against the Taliban itself. The U.S. was in part fighting ISIS-K when we were there, as well as the Taliban. The Afghan government was fighting against ISIS-K. They've expanded their attack footprint, first into Pakistan, and now more broad.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Michael Morrell.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
You just mentioned some of the attacks that ISIS-K has carried out, and you sort of talk about, I guess, more conventional types of attacks in the paper and the foreign affairs article. Is that where you see these independent cells around the world, taking attacks like like the Moscow theater, as opposed to flying an airplane into a building? Is it a different level of attack that you're concerned about?
So I think the most likely, all these groups study security vulnerabilities, right? The security vulnerabilities, as you know, that were there pre-9/11 are gone, right? Close to all of them. But that doesn't mean that people can't identify, new vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that we didn't fix. So I don't want to rule anything out. But the most likely kind of attack are the kinds of attack we saw in the Moscow concert, right? Sort of large public grouping of people, not enough security to keep out what you need to keep out. And that's a vulnerability, and that's the most likely kind of attack.
So that's the kind of attack. Can we? One of the other things that you mentioned that you and Graham mentioned in the article, which I think is important, especially when you're focused on some of these attacks, are Section 702.
Yeah.
And the legislation around that. Can we talk about that for a minute or two?
Yeah, I'll say two things about it. Only one of which we talked about in the paper. The one we talked about in the paper was that some of what we learned about the current terrorist threat to the homeland came from the administration's declassification of vignettes about the value of 702. And one of those vignettes in particular, Andy, was the FBI saying that they had foiled an external terrorist attack inside the United States against critical infrastructure last fall. Man, there it was, declassified, right? The other thing I'd say about 702 is if the United States intelligence community is going to get the information it needs to prevent an international terrorist group from organizing an attack here, it's going to be with 702. It's incredibly important, as you know.
Right. You also mentioned a few moments ago about the shift in focus for the intelligence community overall. And it reminded me that at the beginning of the Bush administration, certainly Secretary Rumsfeld was talking about the pivot, the shift to China. And then 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
And so everyone sort of shifted over towards terrorism, and we did that for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Now that this shift to China is back, and certainly rightly so. Can we do both? Like, it seems like we tend to do the soccer ball thing. Everyone runs to the ball kind of thing.
It's exactly the point I was going to make, right? We tend to overcompensate. So when we made the shift to terrorism post 9/11, man, did we walk away from China and Russia, right? Russia in particular. And here we are now with the most significant invasion of a European country since World War II by Russia. Would we be in a different place with Russia today if we had, maintained more focus on Russia? I have no idea. Don't know. But at least it would have been a better chance. So, that's one answer. The other answer is it is absolutely possible to do both. We absolutely have the resources to do both. The thing, that's number two. Three is, the thing I worry most about is the focus and time of the senior leadership. Given what's happening in Ukraine, given what's happening in the Middle East, given what's happening, in our relationship with China, I'm worried that people just don't have enough time to give to this issue that it deserves. I got some feedback, Andy, from people I just ran into, current government employees I just ran into on the street after Graham and I published this. Their message was pretty much the same. Glad you guys wrote this. It's important. I interpreted that, maybe not correctly, but I interpreted that as them saying, hey, you got this pretty right. And maybe, when they said, and it's important, maybe there's not enough focus on it. Maybe there's not enough of a sense of urgency, on it. That's not explained by the fact that nobody cares about this, right? It's explained by the fact that people have way, way, way too much to do.
So how do we change the focus? How do we change the debate to create, and I don't mean this in an artificial way, but to create the sense of urgency? I mean, prior to 9/11, you had several people, George Tenet certainly being in the lead, worried, saying to policymakers, I'm concerned about this. As I said at the beginning, lots of articles in the PDB. And even then, maybe there wasn't a sense of urgency, and maybe because we didn't have, very specific information. Maybe that's the deal.
We still don't have specific information, right?
Right. And so maybe it's the lack of specific information. What is it you want me to do? Kind of, equation. But what can we fundamentally do to change the debate?
So I think it's so to change the debate, right? I think, I think a couple of things would be helpful. One, and you'll understand this, is one of the things Graham and I call for is a public, open congressional hearing that brings together all of the key people who have a view, who run organizations, who have a view on the terrorist threat to the homeland, and have an open hearing. Some of them have been pretty silent about the terrorist threat. Is that because they have different views than what FBI Director Wray has been saying, and different views from what we say in the article? It would be good to know that, right? It'd be good to have an open hearing, talked at the level that you can talk, right, about the threat to the homeland. That is a way to create some public awareness and some public pressure, to do something about this. I think the most important thing, and you will get this, Andy, in a nanosecond, is, what is a sense of urgency first, right? A sense of urgency is working with, a seriousness of purpose and against an aggressive timeline, right? That's what sense of urgency is. One of the ways you get that is by having the President of the United States call an NSC meeting to get a briefing on the threat and what's the plan for dealing with it, right? And then to ask for regular follow-up sessions. What does that do? It gets people focused for that initial meeting, focused on exactly what the threat is and focused on putting a plan together. And then those follow-up meetings create a sense of urgency on following through on that plan, right? Heads of agencies can do that too. Leon Panetta did that regularly, right? I don't know if I'm not saying that's not happening. I don't know, right? I just don't know. It's not my sense that it is.
So another aspect of this is the general public. And it seems for many of us, terrorism has receded into the past. We don't tend to think about it very much anymore. And I'm not suggesting we create panic or people start worrying about it every day.
That,
right. But there's also that aspect of it, that there isn't a strong public view about this, simply because we haven't had an attack here for, over 2 decades.
I don't think it's just the public. Yeah. It's certainly true of the public. I think it's true of the government in general. I think, think about the watch list we just talked about. I think in many people's mind, the threat receded, and it did. It absolutely did for a while, but it doesn't mean it can't come back. So I think that sense exists in the government. It absolutely exists in the media. Our article led to flurry of media stories and some interviews, and it's like they rediscovered terrorism. Yeah. And then certainly with the public, as you mentioned. But I think it's pretty much everything. What you described, it cuts across society as a whole.
Michael, one of the interesting things post 9/11 was that certainly the intelligence community ended up talking to people that we probably typically didn't talk to because there was sort of a common concern. Is that true today too? I mean, you talked about ISIS-K attacking Iran, attacking Russia. They're no friends of Pakistan. The Taliban. Yeah. Is there common ground here, or is this the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing?
So we actually say in the article that we should be working with the Pakistanis against ISIS-K. It's interesting. post 9/11, when we were aggressively working against al-Qaeda, we ran assets from Afghanistan into Pakistan to learn what al-Qaeda was doing there. Now we need to do the opposite, right? Now we need to run assets from Pakistan into Afghanistan to learn what ISIS-K is doing. So how do you do that? The only way to do that is to work with Pakistan. And then we actually suggest maybe we hold our nose and we work with the Taliban against ISIS-K. They are a common enemy. And we're not the only ones who have thought that way. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stepped down last year, has said that publicly. So even when he was still chairman, so it's not a crazy idea.
Yeah,
and certainly, for an organization like CIA, that's the kind of we talk to everybody, right?
Right.
So Andy, what's your sense here? Right, you read the article. You've read other things about this now. We just had a conversation. What's your sense?
Well, first, I'm glad that you and Graham wrote the article. This is something that I talked about in my classes, especially focused on Christopher Wray and sort of him sort of upping the temperature at almost every time he talks makes you pretty concerned, as when the director of the FBI says things like this. So I'm glad this is sort of now bubbling up for more people to pay attention to. Ultimately, on a positive note, this country can defeat any threat that it faces. I certainly believe. We mobilized against al-Qaeda and essentially eradicated them. We can do the same with ISIS-K. It's just a matter of attention, right? This is not oh gosh, what are we going to do now? It's just a matter of focus and attention, and I think we're fully capable of defeating ISIS-K if in fact they're the ones that are planning these attacks. But a broader point is that we've got to make sure that we don't have to go through these cycles of paying attention and then letting it lapse, and then all of a sudden having to pay attention again, hopefully not because of an attack, but maybe because of things like that Christopher Wray is saying, this article, and what others are saying. You've got to keep it on a sort of a steady pace over time, which is not always a strength of the country, right? We tend to, go back and forth between whatever's important at the time. So that's sort of what I think about what's going on.
Yeah. So as you were talking, Andy, I was thinking, what's at stake here? And you helped crystallize the answer for me. One is obviously the lives of Americans, right? Shouldn't lose focus on that. The others are, one is what you said, which is if there's a successful attack by an international terrorist group here in the homeland, we're going to focus on terrorism again like there's no tomorrow, and we're going to lose focus on things like China, right? So that's at stake. And then the other thing is at stake is after 9/11, we came together as a country. I'm not sure that would happen in our current political environment. I'm not sure we would come together. I think this would actually divide us further.
Yeah, that's a real sober warning.
Yeah.
But you're right. After 9/11, you sort of feel it everywhere you went, right? Yeah. Someone attacked us.
Yes.
And it was, as you remember from the what was going on the Hill and at the White House, it was apolitical. It
eventually became more political when they started blaming CIA and FBI. But, for a long time, we were all together.
Right.
Yeah.
Michael, thanks so much for the discussion and the interesting views on the article that you and Graham wrote.
Thanks, Andy. It's a good conversation, I thought. Thank you.
That was Michael Morell. I'm Andy McCretis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.